So let me introduce you to our next guest. They come all the way from NC-SARA, and one is at the beach. First, we have Jeannie Yockey-Fine. She is the General Counsel at NC-SARA. She analyzes the federal and state regulations, SARA policies, and professional licensure issues and their impacts on SARA institutions and related policy conversations. So Jeannie was a senior state regulatory services specialist with Hogan Lovells, and prior to joining NC-SARA. And during 2014 and 2018, she was a state regulatory services advisor with Cooley and was senior manager state regulatory services at Dow Loans from 2015. So she's got tons and tons of experience. She assisted all of her clients with state-related authorizations, NC-SARA applications and their requirements, and state-level professional licensure issues. Previously, she was the licensure manager and education policy analyst at the Florida Department of Education's Commission for Independent Education and overseeing the unit responsible for licensing nearly 1,000 institutions. Oh gosh. Jeannie has given numerous presentations and workshops about state authorization, professional licensure, and regulatory compliance issues. She's also co-authored several papers related to that, and she holds a BS in journalism and a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Kansas. That's okay, we love her anyway, and she's been an attorney since 1991. Now to introduce Dr. Marianne Boeke. She joined NC-SARA in 2018. She's a senior director for research and state support. She oversees all aspects of data reporting, which I know was an interest of everyone. She curates the state authorization surveys, the guide, and provides state and regional compact support. And along with senior leadership, she works on policy-related issues. So prior to joining NC-SARA, Marianne served as the senior associate at the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, NCHEMS. She worked on a variety of both long and short-term projects, collaborating with the Aspen Institute, the Gates Foundation, with Lumina, and with the National Science Foundation, Strata, Witchy, WeSet, all that good stuff. Marianne has also held administrative positions at the American University, the University of Denver, and during the inaugural years of the Western Governors University. Marianne's work in state authorization began in 2011 when she co-created the SHIO survey on state authorization. And I'm certain a lot of you have participated in that. She's presented at numerous national, regional, and state conferences and co-wrote several white papers on a variety of state authorization topics, including state authorization and military students, and state authorization and non-credit courses and programs. Marianne has a PhD in higher education from the University of Denver, a master's degree from the American University, and a bachelor's degree from San Jose State University. Her areas of specialization and interest include evaluation, qualitative research, accreditation, assessment, post-secondary attainment, technology and costing issues in higher education, competency-based education, state authorization compliance, and federal and state regulation. So Marianne is interested in all of the things. So with that, I am happy to introduce Dr. Marianne Boeke and Jeannie Yockey-Fine. Take it away, ladies.
All right.
Thank you. Can you see the screen, Jeannie?
Yes.
Okay.
It looks good, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. And Marianne, if you can move, thank you so much. I'll be talking about the current SARA landscape, NC-SARA updates. We've had a few things happening lately, and then I'll hand off to Marianne to talk about one of her favorite subjects, which is data, and a little specific data to Missouri. And then we want to save plenty of time for questions and discussion, and it can be about anything. It doesn't have to be about what we covered today. And that's often what happens in these webinars. We come up with questions that people come up with questions we hadn't thought about for the topic of the day. So we want to make sure that everyone understands we're open to whatever you have to ask. And with that, we'll move on. Marianne, thanks. So the current landscape is looking pretty good. We have over 2,300 participating institutions now. I think we're up to 2310 to be exact. And as you look at the sector breakout, publics still have the majority of the institutions, but the nonprofits are really close behind that. And you can see that only a little over 6% are actually nonprofits. Now, we do know, of course, that nonprofits do have a lot of enrollment. I'm sorry, the for-profits. For-profits do have a lot of enrollment, but they do make up the smallest percentage of institutions other than our 3 tribal institutions. And you see the breakout by regions, and Emily covered that earlier, but that's, our map looks a little bit different, but it shows the same thing. Next slide, please. For those of you that weren't in state authorization compliance prior to SARA's existence, and there are more of you out there now than in the early days of SARA, a lot of people don't really know how the world looked in state authorization compliance before SARA came along. I was one of those people that was there before SARA and was sitting at the table as SARA was being drafted. And at that time, I was a regulator, and I can tell you that when the federal regs came out back in 2010, oh my gosh, my desk was flooded with so many emails. I was receiving so many phone calls. At one point, I know I had 400 that were related to what do we do about this. Shortly thereafter, I left and went to DC to work for a law firm and left all that behind. But for that little bit of time, it was very concerning. And I can remember our executive director, Sam Ferguson, who's still there, brought me this great big printout of all the federal regulations, plopped it on my desk and said, here, Yockey-Fine, figure it out. So yeah, for those of us who were there, you know how things have changed in the past 10, 11 years. So I'm just going to touch on that a little bit. Bottom line, things were super expensive then for institutions that were trying to do business in all the states. And it wasn't just about the cost, although that was huge. It was also about labor. It took a lot of people to try to get the job done. And guess what? Some institutions didn't have a lot of people to get the job done, which meant that one person was trying as best as he or she could, or they, to do that. And it created a lot of workshops, a lot of webinars, a lot of work with SAN, and to figure that out. And people did as best as they could. But what happened a lot of times was, because there was so much bureaucracy, so much to that process, some institutions chose to simply not have programs in certain states. So what did that mean? That meant that some students weren't able to benefit from programs that they would have liked to have had. And I can't tell you how many calls we received from people saying, well, why won't so-and-so institution let us be a student? And, you know, that's a hard thing to have to tell a student or try to explain. So, you know, with SARA, of course, that process has been simplified. For SARA participating institutions that looking at multiple different states, what their requirements are, because of course they're all different. Looking at the cost, can we afford to reach into this state? How many, a lot of it was looking at how many students do we have? If we only have a handful of students, do we just say no and look at those states where we have a lot more students? So a lot of factoring had to go into that. So that whole process has definitely been simplified. Protections have actually been enhanced. Prior to SARA, only 12 states were actually regulating distance education. Once SARA came along, some states decided to align with some of the requirements of SARA, including having oversight of distance ed, even independent of SARA. So now about half the states actually do regulate distance ed outside of SARA. And another enhancement was that SARA, of course, requires accreditation. And currently, 1/3 of the states do not require accreditation for degree granting programs. So it's another way that consumer protection has been lifted. The streamlining of regulations, I touched on that a little bit already. Again, when you're trying to figure out regulations in multiple states, it's extremely confusing. And of course, especially during the last decade, during the early SARA years, a lot of states were changing those regulations quite frequently. It slowed down a little bit. It's not quite, there aren't quite as many changes as there were prior to SARA, but they're still out there. And again, as I mentioned, students sometimes had to settle for a program they wouldn't have settled for otherwise because they didn't have as many options. And then again, to Marianne's favorite topic, we have data. With SARA, it's a streamlined process on data. People have their handbook to look at. They know what they need to send. They know how they need to send it. And it is common so that people are all sending the same type of data. The numbers go in, and Marianne and her team are able to go through those and share those with you so that everyone has an idea of what's going on with our SARA participating institutions. Next slide. So what's happening now? We just came out of our fall board meeting. That was last Friday. And for those of you who were able to attend the public session, you know that things were tabled. We had 3 items that had gone to the board, and that was about section 8.2 and 8.3, the 21st century guidelines, and branch campuses. And all 3 were tabled with the intent of having more input come from all of our stakeholders and taking more time to get that input. Our branch campus proposals came out of a working group that was made up of several SPEs and had compact involvement and had also institutions. But still, with those proposals, the board would like for another round of input to come back in. And so we're probably looking at a year before we see any policy changes at this point. And another thing that's happening is more work on the policy revision cycle. We've had requests to, the compacts and NC-SARA staff have been working on that a lot already. But our RSC chairs want to look at that more and work on that more with all of us. So that will take time as well. So again, I think the earliest we could expect any actual changes to be approved by the board is probably next fall. Again, if something would come up, however, that would need, to align with some federal change or something, although those are pretty slow too, we could always vote sooner, but that's my expectation. We have some website updates too. And if you've been on our website recently, you've noticed some things have been moved around. Some things might look a little bit different, but it's all about making it more user-friendly. And now that I have found where things are, I think it is more user-friendly, but I'm usually slow on those things. So it took me a while to find things. But now, again, that I'm used to, it's like, oh yeah, that does make sense. So Melanie Booth worked a lot on that with our IT team. And so we feel pretty good about that. One of the things that some people asked for, and one of the things I've been asking for a long time, is to be able to search for an institution by its name so that you don't have to know what state that institution's in. And that's something that our IT team is almost ready to roll out. And I think that will be a very welcome thing. We also got feedback on that from our recent SPE survey. We had some states ask for that too. So we were happy to be able to say that we were already working on that. Next slide, Marianne, please. The SARA Source, it really is going to happen. And for those that aren't familiar with the words SARA Source, that's the student catalog that you've heard about for a long time. And that rollout should actually be happening in 2022. It will be a searchable catalog of programs for students to know where things are, who's offering what. If they're interested in something, they can go into that and find their program and see what institutions have that, how that looks. It is voluntary. We've been going through alpha and beta a long time with some institutions that volunteer to put their information in so that it can keep being tested. But eventually when it opens up, it'll still be voluntary for SARA participating institutions. So institutions do not have to participate, but I think those that do will feel that it's a really good advantage to have that. And there's no cost to the institution for participating in that. The learners will be able to email the institution to ask additional questions. Once they see the program, there'll be a direct link to that. they'll be able to print it out. They'll be able to do a comparison with other programs at institutions, all within that SARA Source system. Our staff will review the input to make sure that it aligns with what's being promoted by the institution on their website or in other ways, so that there will be that check to make sure that what's in there is as accurate as possible too. Next, we also are working on an institutional advisory committee, and nominations have been coming in. We have a lot of them. I don't know what that number's up to, but there's a lot of interest in that, which is very exciting. And that's still open the rest of the month. So I think it's wonderful that so many people want to be involved. That's great. And I know that we had a lot of good feedback from our institutional conference that we had, and just a note that our next one will be sometime in mid-July. And of course, as soon as we lock that date in, then we'll let everyone know. All right, now I'm handing off to Marianne.
Jeannie, thank you so much. I'm going to talk about data reporting. And as Jeannie pointed out, we left plenty of time at the end for questions, whether it's about what we've talked about or something else. So just bear that in mind as we go through these. So I'm going to start off with just talking for a few minutes about why SARA even collects data. Really, collecting, reporting, and analyzing data, it's an important part of our mission. But more importantly, it was part of the promise that we made to states when they became members. The states really did collect data from out-of-state institutions, but it was done differently in each state. The timing was different in each state, and whether or not that was shared or public varied widely by state. So one of the things that we did when NC-SARA became an entity was say, well, we'll go ahead and we'll be collecting that data across the country, and we'll be sharing it and making it public with everyone. And the states really liked that. And the institutions did too, because at that point, they were trying to do the different agreements with each of the states, and keeping track of that and doing different things was hard. So this was just more uniform, standardized, made it a little bit easier. History of the SARA data reports goes back 6 years. We've actually been doing it for 6 years. And that's on the exclusive distance education enrollment. For the last 3 years, we've been doing the out-of-state learning placements, fondly referred to as OSLIP. And we've got our website down there if you want to learn a little bit more about why we collect data and the mission of collection. So what is the SARA data? Well, institutions report their exclusively distance education enrollments. This is the same information that you report to iPads in your fall EF report. The only difference here is that we disaggregate it by state. And actually, that's a little bit of an untruth. There's 2 other little small things that we do that's different than the EF iPads report. That is, we ask you to report your military students from where the activity is actually taking place, which is slightly different than what iPads asks. And the other is that we have a slightly different way of collecting branch campus data. Currently, that is not mandatory to report your branch campus data, but most institutions actually do. I want to say about 85% already report it, and that is different than iPads. So there is a few small things that are different there, and of course, the big thing is just aggregating it by state. For the out-of-state learning placements, we're really asking institutions to report on-ground and online student placements. This does not include in-state placements, so we're just looking for the ones that cross state lines. So the annual data report. This year, we asked 2,216 institutions to report their data. We did give 11 exemptions because of COVID or because they were in the non-renewal status. And 4 institutions did not report. So really that gave us a 99.8% response rate. That is phenomenal, given what's going on in the world right now. Not only have we been dealing with COVID, which is really difficult personally and professionally, But when you think about institutions that ended up having to lay off or furlough many, many, many of their staff and trying to get them to come back and then do all of this data reporting, it really is a testament to the institutions that participate in SARA and to all of you actually for doing really exceptionally hard work under hard circumstances. And we recognize that. So a huge thank you to our institutions. And a big thank you also to our states, our SPs, and our regional compacts. Emily and her team, you know, it takes a village. It really does to collect data from 2,200 institutions across the country in a 4-week period. And we really rely on the SPs and the regional compacts to help get the word out and to answer questions and to just kind of help us get it done. So a big thank you to everyone there. As you can see on this right, we've got a little chart there that shows how we've grown in terms of institutions. So in 2015, there were 846 institutions that reported. And last year we had 2,201. Here's just a really quick chart about reporting institutions by regional compact. This is kind of a fun one to look at. You can see that in the MEC region, there were 623 institutions that reported this last year. And that actually is the second largest right after SREB at 986. I also like to show this one because it's sort of fun to look at this too, to see where you fall in MEC. So here are the institutions that reported for MEC states, and you can see the arrow pointing to Missouri. You had 75 institutions report, which looks like the third largest in the MEC region. This is just a quick slide. You've probably seen this number already, but I just wanted to throw it up here really quick. We had a lot of exclusive distance education enrollments this year. This was not a surprise, but you can just see how large it was. It was almost twice as much. So last year we had about 3 million. This year, almost 6 million. Again, not a big surprise. Everyone had to, switch gears at the last minute and go into remote learning and do distance education. So this didn't surprise us, but it's just nice to have a number to hang your hat on. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of years, I think. Reported out-of-state and in-state exclusively distance education enrollment in MEC states. Again, I think it's just fun to see where you fall in the region. So here's Missouri right here with that green arrow. You can see the out-of-state exclusively distance education enrollment on top in the blue, and the in-state in the kind of cranberry red. So you can see for your state, the majority actually did stay in state. It wasn't out-of-state enrollment, it was the in-state enrollment, which actually is true for most of what happened last year. So this is overall findings for out-of-state learning placements. We had about 260,000 out-of-state learning placements. And that was a decrease, but I think what the surprising thing here is, at least for me, was that the decrease was only about 4%. I really expected that to plummet. So I think the major takeaway here is that internships and clinicals still happened. They did. They made a way to make them happen. And we're really looking at the ones that cross state lines here. So this doesn't include the virtual internships, which I know did happen. There was quite a bit of that as well. But this number is just about the ones that happened in person. So I think that's pretty remarkable that we only had a 4% dip when you think of what was going on. And as always, the majority were in healthcare. In fact, that number went up a little bit, and I think that makes sense too. Those are the ones that were needed. People needed to get done so they could enter into the healthcare industry, and it was a real need for that over the last 18 months, 2 years. So now I'm going to switch gears and just talk about Missouri's data a little bit. So I always like to start with this slide so you can see Missouri. I'm sure you all know what it looks like, but more importantly is the information to the left. We've got our MET contact over there, Emily, Leah as well. State portal entity contact is Leroy, Wade, and Laura. We've got their information there. I'm sure you're very familiar with all of them, but I like to put it up there just so everyone can see. So here's just some quick data for Missouri. The first is that 75 SARA participating institutions from Missouri reported, and they all reported. We didn't have any non-reports, woohoo, from Missouri, so that's awesome. Total in and out exclusive distance education enrollments in Missouri was just over 90,000. And total exclusive distance education enrollment in state reported by other SARA institutions, so that means coming in, was almost 30,000. The top states incoming students was Illinois, Texas, and non-SARA, which hint, hint, might be California. And top states for outgoing students is Arizona, Kansas, and Utah. And that really just means, so the first one is where do you get your students, and the second one is where are your students going. So that's a little bit of the definition there. Top institutions for incoming students for exclusively in distance education were Maryville, Columbia, and Webster. And that changed a little bit this year than in past years, partly because it was just a lot more volume. So that switched around some of the schools for this year. So we'll see if that happens again next year as well. So for the out-of-state learning placement data, these are these internships and clinicals, learning placements that we've been talking about. The outgoing from Missouri institutions was about 10,000, and the incoming was about 6,500. And the top categories for Missouri looked very similar to the nation, and that is healthcare was number one, then education, and then psychology. And that hasn't changed since we started collecting data. Finally, I wanted to just do a snapshot of this. This is the data dashboards. For those of you who have been looking at the data for the last few years, you know that we usually have kind of a website where you have to go through a few clicks to figure out what your state was doing. And we had some raw data in an Excel spreadsheet, and it just wasn't very user friendly. So this year we did something a little different. We put it all into these dashboards, and that runs under Tableau. And it's just so much more user friendly. And you can get all the data and more that you could ever want on these data dashboards. And we've actually filled it in from that 2015 number upward. So you can go back and look at past data too if you'd like to do that. This is just the splash page, I'll call it, the front page that has how to use the dashboards, some definitions, some qualifying statements. And then at the top up here, you can actually go to the different pages and drill down into the data. And again, a lot more user-friendly. And more importantly, if you want to print it or save it, you can. So that is really, really nice. This is the first time we've done it this way, so we welcome feedback. We expect to get some feedback over the next year on this, and we'll try and make next year's even a little bit better. With that, I'll stop and see if we've got any questions, again, about anything that we've talked about here today or anything else that you're dying to ask us. And I'm sure Emily will pop on too with us if there's questions that maybe go for her or for us. We're a team.
So if you do have a question for Marianne or Jeannie or even for Emily or Leah, then if you can go ahead and unmute yourself and just shout out your question, or you can type it in chat. In the meantime, those of you who've been in meetings with me before know I always have questions. So get out my sheet of paper with all my questions on them. So the data thing, to me, I'm kind of a data nerd myself, so I appreciate all that information. The huge increase in distance education students, it's not really surprising because of COVID, but I did appreciate, I don't know if you mentioned it here, but in general, institutions are considering keeping or increasing their online. Is that your understanding from the data?
That is true. So what I didn't mention was that we didn't want to just have numbers for our data report that we do. So one of the things that the data team did is a qualitative study, a quick survey, if you will, of all the institutions that submitted data. And we actually got a really good response rate. We got, something over 30% response rate. And that really helped us put some context around these numbers. And one of the questions we asked was, hey, is this just a blip? Do you expect next year to just go all the way back to what you were doing in 2019? And we got a resounding no. What we heard was, hey, not everything's going to be online. That's not going to happen. But we absolutely are going to keep more online than we thought we were going to do. Some of it worked really, really well. So that's what's going to be really interesting, I think, in the next couple of years, is to see what the numbers do, because I don't think they're going to go back down to that 3 million number that we saw in 2019, but where will they go? And it'll be interesting to see that. I think what we really heard loud and clear from the institutions from this survey, too, to put the context around it, was that, by and large, a lot of institutions, particularly smaller schools and community colleges, did have less enrollment. That happened. But when you're looking at exclusive distance education enrollment, that really did go up across the board. So it was an opportunity to go online and to do something a little different and to keep some of the students engaged. And they were so glad they had that option. But more work needs to be done, because we all know that remote learning is really not the same thing as quality distance education. So I think this was a way to put their toe in it. But also what we heard from institutions was, wow, this is not as easy as just giving a microphone and a Zoom link to faculty. There's a lot more to it than that. We need to really invest and think about how to do this in a quality, meaningful way for students. But on the flip side of that, what we heard from a few faculty was, this isn't as bad as we thought. There can be learning done. So I think it was really eye-opening on both sides, and it'll be really fun to see what happens in the next few years. Great question.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, we did have a question in chat. Pop that up. I closed it down. The SARA complaint process, as an institution, do we provide the contact information for the Missouri State Portal entity, for each state portal entity, or both? Be a cheeky question.
Right, you will provide that of the Missouri State Portal entity. So you provide what is there for your home institution.
And I apologize for my lighting here. It's very interesting. The sun is just beating into my room, and I have the windows closed, but I look like I'm psychedelic.
Oh, like an old timey, like the static on the screen or something. You look great.
Yeah.
We did have another question in chat. In regards to out-of-state learning placement reporting, will the criteria be the same as last year?
Yes. Let me say that again. Yes. We heard loud and clear from institutions, stop messing with it. So yes, we really want to keep it the same. I think we finally figured it out. The first year or two, it was a little bit tough. I think and when I say we, I'll take it. The staff at NC-SARA learned how to ask a little bit better and put some parameters around what we were trying to get at. And I think institutions also had a great hand in giving us some constructive feedback in that. So yes, the criteria will stay the same.
Awesome. And talking about policies, not necessarily data collection, and you guys had referred to it in your comments. As the state of Missouri, we really appreciate NC-SARA kind of going to like a 1-year loop, because we are already behind in matching our regulations to the current manual. And for Missouri institutions, getting regulations through takes at least 6 months, usually 8, and that's if it makes it off the ground. But we are actually on a very aggressive rule review schedule, and we will be updating our SARA regulations this year. Yeah, well,
and one of the things, Laura, that the board is aware of too, and it happened a while back with appeals, is making sure that even if they approve something that, if it's something that could impact statutes or something, that they give extra time to implement it. So, that's something that, we all need this extended policy review cycle. It's, it's amazing how, and Emily knows this too, as we started looking at it to extend to a year instead of 6 months, how even a year is difficult, to fit everyone in. And with getting feedback, with getting all the proper input, with just thinking through everything, it was funny how 6 months, how easily it stretched into a year. There were still sections when we were looking, it's like, oh my gosh, what about, during the holidays? What about, there's still a lot of things that, we'll still need to work on to even make that work, but it's going to be so much better than the other. But even in addition to that too, we'll all work to make sure that, the board understands that, wait, this is something that for some states, could actually take them 18 months or whatever. Even when we talked about the 21st century guidelines and we asked for input on what institutions would want as long, as far as timeline. Well, as you can imagine, the institutions chose the longer timeline, to make to make things align. So, that's okay though. At this point, of course, we're not even moving forward with those yet, but when that does happen, I still anticipate that, institutions will have that longer timeline to work with everything. Now, in the meantime, of course, more accreditors are saying, all right, you need to do this, but that's, separate from SARA putting that out there.
Well, from the state perspective, it is greatly appreciated. So we had a follow-up question about the SARA complaint contact information. What specific information should we include about SARA and I suppose NC-SARA on the website? Can you provide an example and where you suggest that this be reported on?
So you'll want contact information, and you can you can talk to your state. You can talk to Laura. You can also talk to Emily. But your accreditor, you'll also need your accreditor information in there as well. On your website, you'll want your home state contact information for your state regulator and your SPE, which in Missouri happens to be, mostly the same people. Some states that's not the case. It's quite all right, certainly, to include other states where you have students. For some institutions, when there's only a handful, you can include those states as well. We know that the ultimate requirement is that it comes back to that home state, but some students in other states may reach out to the state where they are, and then of course that SPE would work with the Missouri SPE to get that worked out. So different institutions are doing it differently, but you at least have to have those basics there, so that the student knows where to go. And again, some have just been more proactive and added the other states. And at one point in the federal regs, they were requiring all states to be listed, and then that changed. And so some states or some institutions chose to keep it anyway. So it's not a federal requirement, but it's certainly up to the institution of whether they do more than the basics that I mentioned.
I might just jump in and add a little bit to this too, and that is that MEC actually has done some great work. Emily and Leah, their colleagues, have done some good stuff on this area. And one of the things that actually Jeannie and I used to do way before we worked at NC-SARA together is we'd run around the country talking to institutions about just this issue, and about talking about what Jeannie just said is kind of what you have to do. But you could actually step it up a little bit if you're looking kind of at best practice of this. And this is where you might take a moment on that web page to really have it as a teachable moment for students, to really explain the difference between a complaint and a concern, and how to go about the process in your own institution, and then if you need be, go on from there. And I know that a lot of webmasters and communication directors struggle a little bit with that. But once they see what the faculty or what the compliance person is writing, they realize it is a teachable moment, and it's not, encouraging people to complain just to complain, but it's really giving students information they need to make sure that they know what to do. And really that's reassuring, because you're putting it out there. And the other piece to remember is don't hide it. It really shouldn't be too difficult to find. Jeannie and I used to, this is years ago, but Jeannie and I used to kind of do a little test where we would ask people to look up where they can find the complaint information on not their website, but their neighbors, if we were sitting in a conference together. And you'd be surprised how hard it is. So, have someone outside of your institution try and find it. That's just such a great way to make sure it is easy to find. Because for us, we know exactly where it is, right? We put it there.
And Marianne, thank you for pointing out, the important thing, which is having the process clear for the student at your institution when they have a complaint, because that's where it all begins. And that's where it begins from a state regulatory perspective. That's where it begins from a SARA perspective. And as a former regulator, I know that the great majority of complaints are handled at the institution.
Yeah.
You know, it's so often that it's something that can be handled there. And of course, you know, Laura knows too. I mean, a lot of times it's about, you know, I should have had an A, not a C, or, you know, or I can't stand my professor, you know, I think he's mean. You know, and those are things that, you know, we would send back to the institution and say, you know, please talk to Johnny and work that out. Now, certainly I'm not making light of bigger things that go on, but I am saying that, you know, those things that sometimes you read about that are terrible things, those really are a very small minority of what, you know, come to the state level and would be handled. And of course, for SARA purposes, it would have to go through the institution, but also it would have to be something related to SARA. Other than that, it would be handled independent of SARA by the state regulator.
And I know that that does get a little confusing, who has responsibility over what. And the good thing for Missouri institutions, whether you're a SARA participating institution or not, is that you'll still be talking to the same people, myself, Alicia, or Stephen. So yay on that. I did want to follow up to Del Ann's follow-up question. We do have a session this afternoon, which is kind of an open forum, open discussion. And maybe that's something where our institutions, if you think you have a pretty good setup on your website, maybe you can share with the other institutions. I think that would be a great learning experience for all. So I had one more question, because I always do, and it had to do with the source. Pull up the question here. Do we have like a general time frame in 2020? Will it be spring, summer, fall? And is there information on the SARA website for institutions who maybe kind of want to see what it's about and how they might get involved?
So I think we're looking at spring. Marianne,
Yeah.
please tell me if that's not accurate. With our updated website, I honestly cannot tell you what is on there right now about the SARA Source, but Marianne might know.
It's funny you said that. When she said that, I'm like, you know, if it's not up there, I'm writing that down. That is a super good idea. We should do that.
I was literally like kind of looking at it through my brain, thinking of everything I've looked at there recently, and that was not something I was specifically looking for. So
I'm writing it down.
It might very well be right there, but if not, then
it will be.
Yes.
I think we do have a sentence or two about it, but I think what you're saying is, hey, a little more would be good. You know, talk about what it is, what's going to go in there, how it's going to work, kind of the things that Jeannie walked through. You know, the fact that it's voluntary, there's no cost, it's program information, it's just for SARA participating institutions. I think a little bit of the who, what, when, where, why would be important to have up on the website, especially since we're so close now. We're thinking, you know, in the next few months, we're going to invite institutions to start putting their information in, and then we'll go live hopefully in the spring. The other neat thing about that is that we really are going to do a fun splash about it. Our communications director, Melanie Booth, and Mary Larson, who is in charge of this project, they've got their heads together to try and figure out how to kind of do a big communication blast, because we don't normally communicate with students. That isn't what we do a lot of the time. We deal with states, we deal with institutions. So this is going to be a little bit of a departure from that, but Mary and Mel are working hard on getting the word out and how to do that. So it's really exciting, and I think it's going to be a real need for students. And another piece of that is Mary is working very closely with Credential Engine, because there's a lot of overlap there. For those of you who are familiar with Credential Engine, it's a way to put all of your programs and courses, I believe, not just programs, but courses, into their system so it's searchable. The difference is going to be that for SARA, it's only SARA participating institutions. It is only programs. But the other big difference is that we verify the information, not all of it, but a few pieces of it once a year. And that's a big departure from Credential Engine. But what's interesting is that we've really been working closely with them to make sure that we're using the same data points the same language, so that down the road, it might even be possible to input one and then it goes to the other to make it easier for institutional folks trying to put information in both. So we're still in early days, but we'll make sure we get more information up on the website.
Absolutely wonderful. I really appreciate that. It sounds like a great tool for students and institutions. If you're interested, that information will be on the NC-SARA website. So take a look. Dylan had a question just to confirm. California, to my knowledge, is not a member state of SARA. Do you guys have any information on where they're at? Are they just never interested, or are they still working through the legal process?
I'll let Jeannie take this one, but they are very interested.
Right. I can tell you they in California are the institutions. The institutions definitely want this to happen. A lot of them have been talking with each other, trying to, come together to try to make this happen. So many things have been happening in California, as you know, with their governor and everything else, that I believe this is something that just keeps getting pushed, down the line. I don't see it happening anytime soon because of that. There are a lot of things that California will have to work out from a regulatory perspective, from a statutory perspective, to make it all happen. It certainly can happen. It's no different than other states that had to change some things to make it happen. They certainly can do it. They'll have to work on a few things. California is a state that has a lot of exemptions for institutions, so they'll have to look at how that would fit into everything. So I guess the real bottom line is I wouldn't plan on that for 2022, and we'll see what happens in 2023 or 4.
Or 4. And Alicia knows this well, just a weird quirk of Missouri regulations is that a California institution that is a for-profit can offer distance education in Missouri. Go forth and do it. But a California public institution has to apply specifically to us for permission.
I remember that difference. Yeah. You're the only state that has that difference.
Yeah. We don't hate California. We love California. It's just, that's the way the regulations panned out after a while.
Yeah.
So any last minute questions for our guests this morning? We will have the slide decks available for all of our presenters after this convening. Jeannie and Marianne, thank you guys both so much for taking time. I know you're super busy, especially right after a board meeting. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with Missouri.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, I wasn't muted the whole time. I was worried.